Two boys were born in 1966, 600 miles apart, in two completely different kinds of American houses. They never knew each other existed. They never would. And by the time this story's finished, one of them will be dead by his own hand before he turns 43. And the other will be sitting alone in a one-bedroom apartment, listening to the first hard rain of another winter, still waiting for a life that never quite started. Whatever is left of their families, and there isn't much, are still asking, separately, decades apart, the exact same question. Was there something wrong with him? Or was there something wrong with everything around him? This is the story of why almost nobody could answer that question while it still mattered. And it's the story of what the answer turns out to have been. Found too late for one of them, and just barely maybe in time for the other. Kevin's mother noticed it first when he was 3. Not a tantrum, not a fever. Nothing she could point to. He simply wasn't where other 3-year-olds were. He didn't point at things to show her. He didn't babble back when she talked to him in the voice mothers use for babies who are about to become talkers. He lined up his toy cars along the baseboard of the living room in a configuration that took him most of an afternoon, and he would scream, desperately scream if anyone disturbed it. She didn't have a word for what she was looking at. In 1969, in the small Midwestern town where she was raising him alone, Kevin's father had been gone before Kevin was old enough to form a memory of him. A fact nobody in the family discussed twice. Nobody around her had a word for it either. If Kevin had been born 20 years later, a pediatrician might have had a name to offer his mother in that exam room. He was born into the wrong 20 years, the diagnostic category that would eventually describe him. Autism spectrum disorder did not exist as its own entity in American psychiatry until 1980, when the DSM-3 finally separated it from childhood schizophrenia. Before that, the dominant theory, championed for decades by a psychoanalyst named Bruno Bettelheim, held that children like Kevin had been made the way they were by their mothers, specifically by mothers who were too cold, too withholding, too absent. The profession would later call it the refrigerator mother theory, and it would take until deep into the 1970s for anyone with real institutional standing to challenge it. Kevin's mother, raising him alone, working full days at a job that didn't leave room for parent-teacher conferences, let alone clinical evaluations, never once heard a diagnosis suggested for her son. What she heard when she heard anything at all was that he was difficult, slow, in his own world. He didn't speak in real sentences until he was 8 years old. For 5 years before that, the working theory in his small-town school district was that he was intellectually disabled, possibly deaf, possibly both. He was neither. What was actually happening, though nobody around him had the instrument to measure it, was that his entire processing architecture ran through a different channel than speech. The channel it ran through was sound. His mother had an old upright piano in the front room that had belonged to her own mother, more furniture than instrument by the time Kevin was tall enough to reach the keys. At 4, before he could reliably say his own name, he picked out a melody he had heard exactly once, completely in the correct key, with the correct rhythm. She thought it was a fluke. It happened again and again. By the time he was 7, he could hear a piece of music a single time on the radio and reproduce it on the piano, almost note for note, including, his mother would tell people years later, the mistakes the recording happened to have in it. What Kevin had in language nobody around him possessed yet falls into a category neurologists call savant syndrome, a phenomenon that shows up in roughly 1 in 10 autistic people against less than 1% of everybody else. The leading explanation involves the same neural wiring that made Kevin's life as a social being so difficult, an unusually intense, unusually local kind of attention, one that filters out almost everything except the thing directly in front of it. In a classroom, that wiring made him unreachable. At a piano, it made him extraordinary. Nobody in his town in the 1970s had a framework that could hold both of those facts about the same 11-year-old boy at the same time. So mostly they just held the first one. 600 miles away in a different kind of house entirely, a different kind of boy was being raised to run. Brian's father had been a football coach for almost 20 years by the time Brian was born, and there was never a serious question about what Brian's childhood was going to look like. He was on a peewee team almost as soon as he could be fitted for pads. He was, by every account anyone gave at the time, a strong kid, an energetic kid, smart enough that teachers liked having him in class, even when he wasn't paying attention to them, which was often. He talked fast, he moved fast. He started things he didn't finish and finished things he hadn't actually started on purpose. Like the night he reorganized his father's entire garage at 11, because the asymmetry of the tool board had become, in the space of about 4 minutes, completely unbearable to him, and then forgot to put half the tools back. Nobody in Brian's house was unavailable to him the way Kevin's mother was unavailable to Kevin. His father was right there, every practice, every game. But being looked at and being seen are two different operations. And what Brian's father was looking for was a football player who occasionally lost focus. What was actually standing in front of him, though there was no language anywhere in 1970s suburban America to supply it, was a fairly textbook case of childhood ADHD with traits underneath it that nobody would formally name as autistic until Brian was almost 50 years old. ADHD has an even stranger institutional history than autism. The symptoms had been described in British medical literature as far back as 1902, when a pediatrician named George Frederick Still wrote them up as an abnormal defect of moral control in children, a diagnosis that was really a character judgment wearing a lab coat. It took until the 1960s for the American Psychiatric Association to even agree that the condition was neurological rather than disciplinary, and it wasn't formally named in anything resembling its modern form until the same DSM-3 revision that gave autism its category in 1980. For a child born in 1966, both of the words that might have explained him arrived around his 14th birthday. Dressed in criteria so narrow and so unevenly taught to American clinicians that another full decade would pass before either diagnosis touched ordinary pediatric practice in any meaningful number. Boys like Brian, verbal, sometimes charming, capable of occasional focus so intense it looked like genius, fell straight through the gap between obviously disabled and fine. The label that filled the gap instead was the one sitting in every American household already free of charge. He's just not trying hard enough. By the time Kevin reached school age, the empty hours of his afternoon had become, without anyone designing it that way, the only part of his day that felt survivable. His mother worked until 6 while school let out at 3:15. Those 3 hours alone in the house were by every measure later research would attach to autistic children and unsupervised time, a mercy and a trap at once. A mercy because the unrelenting social performance of the school day finally stopped. A trap because nothing in those 3 hours was teaching him the social skills the rest of his life was about to demand of him without exception. He played the piano. He listened to records his mother had inherited and records he found at a library sale for a dime. Mostly classical, mostly the same 6 or 7 pieces over and over until he had them completely. He was in language a later generation would coin monotropic, capable of a focus on the thing he loved that bordered on total and almost incapable of redirecting that focus toward anything the rest of the world considered important, like long division or eye contact or knowing when a conversation was supposed to end. At school, it went the way it usually went for boys like him in that decade. He was the weird kid, not bullied every single day, but bullied enough and misread by people who had no framework on offer besides the ones they already owned. He's slow, he's strange, something's off with that one. Teachers, untrained in anything resembling neurodevelopmental difference, because almost nobody in American public education in the 1970s was, read his silences as defiance some days and as deficiency on others, depending on their mood more than his behavior. He was passed along grade after grade, mostly because passing him along was easier than working out what else to do with him. Brian's house was never empty the way Kevin's was, and his mask looked nothing like Kevin's either, which was in its own way the entire problem. Where Kevin withdrew, Brian performed. Football gave him a structure that absorbed his hyperactivity and rewarded a kind of explosive physical focus that on a field read as aggression and commitment instead of what it sometimes actually was. A nervous system running too hot with nowhere else to put the charge. He was popular in the specific conditional way athletic boys are popular, which meant he had teammates and almost no actual friends. a distinction it would take him another 30 years to be able to say out loud. He was smart, measurably smart on the test built to measure that sort of thing, and that intelligence did exactly what researchers would later describe in painstaking detail. It let him compensate. He could cram the night before an exam and pull a passing grade through raw cognitive horsepower, which masked the fact that he could not under any circumstances sit through 45 minutes of a lecture that didn't interest him without his mind leaving the room entirely. Teachers called him a kid who didn't apply himself. They meant it as a verdict on his character. It was, as it happened, an almost clinical description of an executive function deficit, spoken in the only dialect available to anyone at the time. There is a third presence in this story, one that never shows up by name in either boy's life, and understanding it is the only way the rest of what happens makes any sense. In the decade both of these boys were growing up, autism was being identified in roughly 1 out of every 2,000 American children. Today, with no meaningful change in human neurology and a great deal of change in diagnostic awareness, that number sits closer to 1 in 36. ADHD diagnosis followed a similar arc, climbing from a vanishingly small fraction of the child population in the 1980s to somewhere around 1 in 10 children by the early 2000s. Run those numbers backward the way researchers eventually did, and the conclusion is hard to avoid. The children of the 1960s and 1970s were not less neurodivergent than the children of today. They were invisible to a system that hadn't built the instruments to see them yet. Apply current prevalence rates to the population of American Gen X men alive right now, and the math lands somewhere past 1 million who likely have autism. A similar number with ADHD, and an unknown but substantial fraction carrying both at once. A combination that wasn't even permitted as a joint diagnosis in the DSM until 2013, by which point the oldest of these men were already 48 years old. That is the third character in this story. Not a person, a gap. A 40-year hole in American medicine that Kevin and Brian were both born directly into on opposite sides of the country, with nothing in common except the year stamped on their birth certificates and the size of the hole. Neither man would ever describe his adult relationships as anything but a sequence of failures he couldn't quite account for. And the research on exactly this phenomenon is uncomfortably specific. Autistic adults are roughly 2.5 times more likely to divorce than the general population, and significantly more likely never to marry at all. For Kevin, it never got as far as marriage. He dated a handful of times in his 20s and 30s, women who were drawn in by his strangeness and his obvious undefended talent, and who left one after another for reasons he experienced as sudden and mysterious, and that they almost certainly experienced as a long accumulation of small moments where he simply wasn't there the way they needed him to be. He wasn't withholding anything. He didn't know there was a there to be in. Brian got further than Kevin ever did, and it cost him more for the privilege. He married at 34 a woman he'd known less than a year, and the marriage lasted 58 days. He would describe it decades later as the worst 8 weeks of his life, not because anything dramatic happened, but because nothing he did seemed to land the way he meant it to. She would cry, and he genuinely would not understand why, would ask sincerely what was wrong, and would be told that the fact he had to ask was itself the problem. A sentence that detonated something in him every time he heard a version of it for reasons neither of them had a name for. Researchers who study late diagnosed autistic and ADHD men have written about the exact experience sitting on the other side of that exchange. A man honestly processing his partner's emotional signals through a system that simply doesn't read them the way his does, mistaken for coldness by everyone in the room, himself included, for years. Work treated the two of them in almost opposite ways, and that difference turned out to matter enormously for how each of their lives unfolded. Kevin took a job as a janitor at the local community theater the year he turned 20, and he kept it essentially unchanged for the rest of his working life. To anyone measuring by ambition, it looked like a waste of an obvious gift. What it actually was, though nobody around him would ever have framed it this way, was one of the only environments in his entire town that happened to suit him almost perfectly. He worked nights after the last show let out, alone, in a building with excellent acoustics and a piano. Nobody minded if he touched once the cleaning was finished. The sensory chaos that wrecked him in crowded daytime spaces simply wasn't present. The social demands that exhausted him were close to zero. Without anyone designing it on purpose, Kevin had accidentally found accommodation. Brian never got that lucky. He started college on a partial athletic track and washed out within 3 semesters. The structure of high school football gone, the structure of mandatory class attendance gone with it, nothing left to externally organize a brain that had never once learned to organize itself. What followed was 25 years of jobs that ended the same way. Strong starts, real enthusiasm, a manager who liked him for the first few months, and then a slow unraveling as missed deadlines and forgotten instructions, and a temper that flared faster than he could catch it, accumulated into a conversation that always opened with some version of, "This isn't working out." Research on adult ADHD and employment puts a number on exactly this pattern. Roughly 1 in 3 adults with the condition is unemployed at any given time. Chronic job instability running close to a third higher than in the general working population. Brian lived inside that statistic for a quarter of a century without ever once hearing the word that would have explained it. What looked from a distance like a smart kid who never lived up to anything was underneath the precise and well-documented shape of a gifted executive function impaired brain, hitting the exact same wall decade after decade in a slightly different job each time. Both men's mental health, predictably by the research and by the simple math of it, deteriorated in ways nobody around them connected to anything neurological. Depression shows up in something close to half of adults with ADHD. Anxiety runs even higher. For autistic adults, the anxiety numbers are similarly severe. And substance use disorder among people with undiagnosed ADHD runs roughly double the general population. And the research is fairly insistent that weakness has very little to do with it. Alcohol and stimulants do chemically something real for an underregulated nervous system. They quiet the noise imperfectly and at a cost that compounds, which is precisely why so many men found them long before anyone offered an alternative. Kevin's mother died in the winter of 2008. She had been the only stable, unconditional relationship of his entire life. The one person who had never required him to perform a version of himself he couldn't sustain. Within months of her funeral, he had stopped showing up for most of his shifts at the theater. He started drinking the way men drink. Once drinking had quietly become the only tool left in the box. Less than 13 months after he buried her, Kevin was gone too. Not yet 43 years old. He didn't leave a letter that explained any of it in clinical terms because in 42 years, he had never once possessed the vocabulary to describe what had actually been happening inside him. What he left was simply exhaustion with no name attached to it, and nobody left alive who had ever had the chance to go looking for one. It's worth saying briefly that Kevin and Brian's particular tragedy was never a uniquely American one, even though most of the numbers in this story come from American data. In the United Kingdom today, more than 2 in 102 million adults are living with an undiagnosed neurodevelopmental condition, and the waiting list for an adult assessment through the National Health Service can run 3 to 5 years from the day someone finally works up the nerve to ask. Autistic adults in Britain have the lowest employment rate of any disabled group in the country, a figure that has barely moved in over a decade. Canada and Australia carry the same underlying pattern, wrapped in a slightly different cultural packaging. A regional ethic of stoicism and self-sufficiency that made men even less likely to raise the question in the first place. Germany sorts children into academic or vocational school tracks at age 10 or 11, early enough that an undiagnosed neurodivergent boy could be quietly routed away from a university future before anyone had seriously asked why he was underperforming. Japan's cultural weight on conformity meant that for decades only the most visibly severe presentations of autism were recognized at all, leaving an entire population of verbal, intelligent Japanese men in a version of the same desert with even less institutional language available to name it. Wherever you looked across the developed world in the second half of the 20th century, the shape of the failure was nearly identical. Only the accent changed. Brian, unlike Kevin, was never visibly different enough for anyone to suspect a problem with an actual name attached to it. And that turned out to be its own particular curse. Researchers studying what's now called the high-functioning trap have found case after case that the most verbally capable, most intellectually intact autistic and ADHD adults are often the ones support systems give up on first, because on paper and frequently in person, for the first 15 minutes of any given conversation, they look fine. Brian looked fine for 30 years. He looked fine through a marriage that lasted 58 days, through 11 jobs, through a slow withdrawal from every friendship he'd ever half built. Because looking fine and being fine had nothing to do with each other, and nobody in his life had a way to tell the two apart. In 2015, at 49 years old, after a stretch brutal enough to cost him his ninth job in 15 years, Brian finally sat across from a psychologist actually trained to see what she was looking at. ADHD came first formally after decades of being told he simply needed to try harder. A few months later came a second assessment, and a phrase Brian had never once heard applied to himself in any context. Autistic traits, clinically significant, almost certainly present since early childhood. The twice exceptional pattern researchers had only started naming in any serious way in the 1990s. A smart child and a struggling one occupying the same body so completely that for decades each fact had simply canceled the other out in the eyes of everyone watching. The research on what happens in the moment a man receives a diagnosis like that in his late 40s describes a fairly specific sequence, and Brian lived through nearly all of it on schedule. First, relief, an explanation finally for a lifetime of experiences that had never once made sense. Then, not far behind it, something closer to fury. Fury at a system that had every diagnostic tool it needed by the time he was in his 30s and simply never once pointed it in his direction. And underneath both of those, quieter and harder to say out loud, the specific grief researchers now call the what could have been reckoning. The almost mathematical exercise of running his actual life against the one he might have had with 30 extra years of understanding and discovering the gap between the two was not small. There is something almost unbearably ironic sitting at the center of both of these men's stories, and it has everything to do with the generation they happen to be born into. Gen X is, by reputation and by a fair amount of actual research, the most self-reliant cohort alive in America today. A generation raised on empty afternoons and unlocked front doors, taught early and taught often that nobody's coming, that you figure it out yourself or you simply don't figure it out. For most of the men that generation produced, that self-reliance became a powerful asset, an adaptability, a stress tolerance, an independence. But for a Kevin or a Brian, that same cultural instinct became something closer to a trapdoor. Self-reliance for an undiagnosed neurodivergent man was never strength. It meant nobody ever found out there was a problem at all, because the whole culture around him had already agreed, without ever once discussing it out loud, that asking for help was the one thing a man in his position was never supposed to do. It matters to say clearly that this is not the same story about Gen X men living alone who chose their solitude and found something stable inside it. Brian's apartment, the one he's sitting in right now as the first real cold of another winter comes down outside the window, is not that. It's the residue of 100 relationships that ended for reasons he could never quite see coming in time. And a culture of self-reliance that for him specifically never once asked the obvious follow-up question, self-reliant or simply alone, because nobody ever showed him there was another way to be. So was there something wrong with Kevin, or was there something wrong with everything around him? Was there something wrong with Brian, or was there something wrong with everything around him? The honest answer, the one the research keeps arriving at, is neither exactly, and also both at once. There was nothing wrong with either man's mind in the sense that phrase usually carries. Different wiring is not the same thing as broken wiring, and the same intensity of focus that made Kevin unreachable in a third-grade classroom is the very thing that let him play a piece back note for note after hearing it exactly once on the radio. What was actually wrong? The part the research is unambiguous about is that two boys were born at precisely the wrong moment in American medical history to receive a diagnosis that already existed in theory and simply hadn't been built out into ordinary practice yet, and that the 40-year gap between the theory and the practice swallowed them and an estimated several million men exactly like them almost entirely whole. Kevin's story doesn't get a better ending. It already happened, and it ended the way it ended. In a winter nobody saw coming because nobody had been looking closely enough to see anything at all. But Brian's story is still being written right now, tonight, in an apartment somewhere with the heat turned a little low because the bill came in higher than he was expecting. He has the diagnosis Kevin never got. He has a real and documented chance at something that looks at least a little different from the last 50 years, if anyone, including him, decides that chance is worth taking. The weight he's been carrying his entire life finally has a name attached to it. What he does with that name is the only part of either of these two men's stories that hasn't been written yet. If this story changed the way you look at the hidden struggles of those around you, please subscribe and like the channel. We are dedicated to uncovering the history and the human experiences that society has often tried to overlook. Let's build a future where no one is left invisible. The next deep dive into our shared past will begin soon.